My girlfriend brought home expensive wine for our anniversary. I told her I had a glass with my brother earlier. She froze and said, "You opened it with Daniel?" The wine glass slipped from Veronica's hand and shattered against our hardwood floor, deep red liquid spreading across the blonde oak like blood seeping from a wound. But it wasn't the broken crystal or the ruined floor that made my stomach drop into my shoes. It was the expression on her face, pure, undiluted terror, masquerading as shock. Her skin had gone the color of old paper, and her lips were moving without sound, like she was trying to solve an impossible equation in her head. When she finally spoke again, her voice came out strangled and thin. "How much did he drink? When did you open it? Is Daniel still here?" I'd been standing in our kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, still wearing my running clothes from the morning jog with my younger brother, holding my phone and scrolling through messages when Veronica had walked through the door with that distinctive burgundy wine bag from Chateau Marchand, the boutique downtown where she worked as their senior sommelier. She'd been glowing with excitement, her dark hair swept up in the elegant twist she always wore for work, her designer dress immaculate despite the September heat outside. "Happy anniversary, love," she'd said, kissing my cheek and setting the bag on our granite counter. "This is a 2009 Chateau Margaux. I've been saving my employee discount for months to get this for us. We'll open it tonight during dinner." That had been 30 minutes ago, before everything I thought I knew about my life started crumbling like a sandcastle hit by a wave, before I'd casually mentioned that my brother Daniel had shown up unexpectedly that morning while Veronica was at work, and we'd seen the wine on the counter with the little gift tag that said, "For my darling Nathan, here's to 3 more years and a lifetime beyond. Love always, V." Before I'd explained that Daniel and I had decided to have a glass to celebrate my anniversary while watching the game, figuring Veronica wouldn't mind since we'd still have most of the bottle left for our dinner. Before I'd watched my girlfriend of 3 years transform from excited and romantic to absolutely petrified in the span of a single heartbeat. Now she was staring at me like I'd just told her I detonated a bomb in our living room, and my brother, who'd left 20 minutes ago to head back to his apartment across town, was potentially in serious danger, though I had no idea why. "Nathan," Veronica said, her voice shaking now, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. "I need you to call Daniel right now. Right now. Ask him how he's feeling. Ask him if he's experiencing any symptoms." Her eyes were wild, darting between me and her phone, which she'd grabbed from her purse with fingers that couldn't quite seem to grip properly. "Symptoms of what?" I asked, but I was already pulling out my phone because something in Veronica's panic was contagious, spreading through my chest like ice water in my veins. "Veronica, what's going on? What's wrong with the wine?" She didn't answer, just grabbed her own phone and started dialing with shaking hands, whispering "no, no, no" under her breath like a prayer or a curse. I called Daniel, and he picked up on the third ring, sounding cheerful and relaxed. "Hey, Nate, I'm about 15 minutes from my place. Thanks again for letting me crash your anniversary prep. That wine was incredible, by the way. Tell Veronica she has excellent taste." "Daniel, how are you feeling?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the fact that my heart was trying to break through my ribcage. "Like, physically? Are you experiencing anything weird? Nausea? Dizziness? Anything unusual?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear traffic noise and the sound of Daniel's car radio playing classic rock. "I mean, I feel fine. Maybe a little warm, but it's hot out and I've got the AC struggling. Why? What's wrong?" Behind me, Veronica was speaking rapidly into her phone in French, her fluent sommelier French that she used with wine distributors and vineyard representatives, and I caught words like emergency and hospital and arsenic that made my blood turn to slush. I told Daniel to pull over immediately and call 911, that something might have been wrong with the wine we'd drunk, that he needed to get to an emergency room right now and have his blood tested. He argued with me at first, saying he felt completely fine and that I was overreacting, but something in my voice must have convinced him because I heard him signal and pull off the road. "Nate, you're scaring me. What the hell is going on?" I told him I didn't know yet, but that I wasn't taking any chances with his health, and to please just go to the nearest hospital and get checked out while I figured out what was happening. He agreed, reluctantly, and I hung up and turned to Veronica, who had ended her own call and was now staring at me with tears streaming down her face and an expression that looked like grief and guilt mixed with pure horror. "Tell me what was in that wine," I said quietly, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm and too cold for the situation. "Tell me right now, or I'm calling the police." Veronica's face crumpled, and she slid down the kitchen cabinet to sit on the floor among the shards of broken wine glass, not even seeming to notice when one of them cut her palm and blood began to mix with the spilled wine. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "Daniel wasn't supposed to drink it. Nobody was supposed to drink it except you, and not until tonight, after dinner, after I'd left to run an errand, so I'd have an alibi when you started showing symptoms." The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to unsee once they'd been spoken. My girlfriend, the woman I'd been planning to propose to next month, the woman I'd been living with and building a future with for 3 years, had just admitted to poisoning wine intended for me. I felt my knees go weak, and I grabbed the counter to keep myself upright while my mind tried to process information that seemed to belong to a completely different reality than the one I'd been living in. Why? I managed to ask, though my throat felt like it was closing up. Why would you want to kill me? Veronica was sobbing now, her whole body shaking with the force of her crying, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers. The money, she choked out between sobs. I needed the money. The life insurance policy we took out last year when we bought the house together. You're worth $950,000 dead, Nathan, and I'm the beneficiary. I have debts you don't know about, gambling debts from my father that he transferred to me before he died, debts that are going to get me killed if I don't pay them back by the end of this month. The people I owe aren't patient, and they aren't kind, and they've made it very clear what happens to people who don't settle their accounts. I'd been living with this woman for 3 years, sleeping beside her every night, making love to her, planning a future with her, discussing children and retirement and growing old together. And for at least the past year, since we'd gotten that life insurance policy through my employer's benefits package, she'd apparently been planning my murder. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced, a psychic wound that felt like it was splitting me open from the inside. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been poisoning me? She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and admitted that the wine was supposed to be the final dose, the one that would finish what she'd been building toward for the past 4 months. She'd been adding small amounts of thallium to my food and drinks, tiny doses that caused the vague symptoms I'd been experiencing and attributing to stress at work, the occasional nausea, the hair thinning I'd noticed, the tingling in my extremities I'd blamed on poor circulation. The wine was supposed to contain enough thallium sulfate to trigger acute poisoning that would present as a heart attack or stroke, especially combined with the buildup already in my system from months of small exposures. She'd planned it meticulously, consulting with someone she'd met through her gambling circles who had access to the poison and knowledge of how to use it without detection. I was still trying to process this information, still trying to reconcile the woman sitting on my kitchen floor with the woman I thought I'd known, when my phone rang. It was Daniel, calling from the emergency room at Georgetown Memorial Hospital. He sounded scared now, telling me that he'd started feeling seriously ill during the drive, that he'd barely made it to the ER before he'd collapsed in the parking lot, that the doctors had taken him back immediately when he'd mentioned potential poisoning. They were running tests now, he said, and had already started him on activated charcoal and IV fluids as a precautionary measure. The ER doctor wanted to speak with me about what substance might have been involved so they could provide appropriate treatment. I put the doctor on speakerphone, and Dr. Ramesh Kapoor introduced himself as the attending physician in the emergency department with 16 years of experience in toxicology cases. He asked me to describe exactly what Daniel had consumed, when he'd consumed it, and whether I had any idea what toxin might be involved. I looked at Veronica, who was still sitting on the floor, and told Dr. Kapoor that my girlfriend had admitted to contaminating the wine with thallium sulfate, and that I'd also consumed a glass of the same wine approximately 90 minutes earlier. I told him that Veronica claimed she'd been giving me small doses of the same poison over the past 4 months, and that I'd been experiencing symptoms I hadn't connected until now. Dr. Kapoor's voice became extremely serious, and he told me to hang up and call 911 immediately for myself, that thallium poisoning was a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention, and that the fact I wasn't experiencing acute symptoms yet was likely due to either a smaller dose than Daniel had consumed or my larger body mass providing a temporary buffer. He explained that thallium is particularly insidious because it can cause delayed symptoms, sometimes taking hours or even days to manifest fully, and that every minute of delay in treatment could mean the difference between full recovery and permanent neurological damage or death. I was already dialing emergency services on my second phone when Veronica stood up from the floor and tried to grab my arm, saying she was sorry, that she never wanted it to come to this, that she'd tried to find another way out of her debt, but there wasn't one. I pulled away from her and walked out of the kitchen, speaking to the 911 operator and explaining the situation, while Veronica followed me, still trying to explain or justify or apologize. I couldn't tell which through the noise of her crying and my own shock-induced numbness. The operator told me an ambulance was being dispatched to my address and that police would be arriving simultaneously given the nature of the call involving suspected attempted homicide. She instructed me to stay on the line, to try to preserve any evidence of the poisoning, including the wine bottle and any remaining contents, and to keep away from the person who'd administered the poison. I told her the suspect was my girlfriend and that she was currently in the same house, and the operator's voice became more urgent, telling me to leave the residence if possible and wait for emergency services outside. I grabbed my wallet and keys and headed for the front door, but Veronica blocked my path, her tear-stained face desperate and pleading. Nathan, please, you have to understand. They were going to kill me. These people don't make empty threats. They killed my father when he couldn't pay, made it look like a suicide, and they told me I had until the end of September to settle his debt plus interest, or I'd end up the same way. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go to the police because these people have connections, and I couldn't declare bankruptcy because the debt isn't in any official records. I was trapped, and you were the only way out. I pushed past her and walked outside onto our front lawn, staying on the phone with the emergency operator while my mind reeled with the implications of everything Veronica had said. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, followed closely by 2 police cruisers, and I found myself being loaded into the back of the emergency vehicle, while paramedics began assessing my vital signs and starting an IV line. I could see police officers entering my house to secure the scene and presumably take Veronica into custody, though I couldn't hear what was happening inside. The paramedics were asking me questions about my symptoms, my medical history, the timeline of the poisoning exposure, and I answered as clearly as I could while watching my house, the home I'd bought with Veronica just 14 months ago, the place where we'd planned to build our life together, become a crime scene surrounded by yellow tape and official vehicles. At the hospital, I was taken immediately to a treatment room where Dr. Kapoor met me, having already coordinated with the emergency responders during transport. He explained that they were treating both Daniel and me for acute thallium poisoning using Prussian blue, a medication that helps bind to thallium in the body and facilitate its excretion before it can cause severe damage. The treatment would continue for several days or potentially weeks, depending on the levels they found in our blood work, and we'd both need to be monitored closely for neurological symptoms, kidney function, and cardiac complications. He told me that Daniel's condition had stabilized after the initial treatment, though he was experiencing more severe symptoms than I was, likely because he'd consumed more of the poisoned wine in the single dose than my body had processed yet from my glass. The blood tests came back within 3 hours, and the results confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. I had significant levels of thallium in my system, consistent with chronic exposure over several months, exactly as Veronica had described. Daniel's levels were dangerously high from the acute dose he'd consumed, and Dr. Kapoor explained that if he'd waited even another 30 minutes before seeking treatment, the outcome could have been catastrophic. As it was, both of us were looking at a long recovery process, possible permanent nerve damage, and the likelihood of ongoing health complications from the poisoning. The doctor's expression was grave as he told me that Veronica's plan had been sophisticated and nearly successful. Thallium poisoning is difficult to diagnose without specific testing, and my symptoms had been vague enough that they could have been attributed to dozens of other conditions until it was too late. While I was receiving treatment, Detective Lisa Fernandez from the County Police Department arrived to take my statement. She was a woman in her early 50s with gray-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a blazer despite the heat, and carrying herself with the kind of competent authority that comes from decades of investigating violent crimes. She explained that Veronica had been arrested at the scene and was currently being held without bail on charges of 2 counts of attempted murder, and that the district attorney's office was building a case that would likely include additional charges related to the poisoning scheme. Detective Fernandez asked me to walk her through my entire relationship with Veronica, any financial arrangements we'd had, the life insurance policy, and every symptom I'd experienced over the past 4 months that I could remember. I spent 2 hours giving my statement, describing everything from how we'd met at a wine tasting event 3 years ago, where she'd been working as a sommelier, to how we'd bought the house together, using her substantial down payment that she'd claimed came from an inheritance from her mother. I told the detective about the life insurance policy we'd taken out through my employer when we'd purchased the house, how Veronica had encouraged me to get the maximum coverage available because you never know what might happen. I described the symptoms I'd been having, the nausea, the hair loss, the tingling in my hands and feet, the occasional confusion and difficulty concentrating that I'd blamed on long hours at my job as a software engineer. Everything that had seemed unrelated and minor suddenly formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore once you knew what you were looking for. Detective Fernandez showed me evidence they'd already collected from the house, including the wine bottle that had contained the lethal dose of thallium, text messages between Veronica and someone named Anton discussing the final delivery, and making sure the package is properly prepared, and financial records that showed Veronica had substantial debts to several offshore accounts that she'd been desperately trying to hide. They'd also found in her home office a journal where she'd documented each dose of poison she'd administered to me, noting the dates, amounts, and my reactions. The clinical detachment of those entries made me feel physically sick in a way that had nothing to do with the thallium in my system. She'd written about poisoning me the way someone might record gardening activities or workout sessions, noting observations like subject showed increased sensitivity to light today and hair loss becoming more noticeable within expected parameters. The police had also discovered that Veronica's story about her father's gambling debts might not have been entirely truthful, or at least not the whole truth. Detective Fernandez explained that they were investigating the possibility that Veronica herself had been the gambler, not her father, and that she'd accumulated massive debts through online gambling sites and private poker games over the past 2 years. Her father, Henri Moreau, had died 18 months ago of what had been ruled a heart attack, but the police were now requesting an exhumation order to test his remains for thallium or other poisons, suspecting that Veronica might have practiced her method on him first before moving on to me. The thought that my girlfriend might be a serial killer rather than just a desperate woman in over her head was almost too horrific to process. Daniel was moved to a room 3 doors down from mine, and once we were both stable enough, I went to see him. He looked terrible, pale and weak, with IV lines running from both arms and monitoring equipment beeping steadily beside his bed. He was 31, 3 years younger than me, a high school teacher with a wife and a baby daughter, and seeing him like this, poisoned because of my girlfriend's scheme, nearly killed because he'd shown up at my house unexpectedly on a Sunday morning, filled me with a guilt so profound I could barely speak. "I'm so sorry," I told him, my voice breaking. If I'd known, if I'd realized what she was doing, I never would have let you anywhere near that wine. This is my fault. Daniel shook his head weakly and reached out to grip my hand with surprising strength, considering his condition. This isn't your fault, Nate. This is on her, all of it. You didn't know. How could you have known? But I should have known, I thought. I should have questioned why I'd been feeling sick so often, should have seen a doctor about my symptoms instead of dismissing them as stress, should have noticed something wrong with Veronica's behavior or finances. But the truth was that she'd been extraordinarily careful and convincing, maintaining her persona as the loving girlfriend while methodically killing me in slow motion. She'd been patient, calculating, and absolutely ruthless in her execution of a plan that had nearly succeeded. The toxicology reports continued to reveal disturbing details over the next several days. The thallium in the wine had been mixed with the alcohol in a way that would have been virtually undetectable to taste, especially in a high-tannin red wine like the Chateau Margaux. Veronica's contact, Anton, turned out to be Anton Volkov, a Russian chemist with connections to organized crime who'd been selling thallium and other exotic poisons to wealthy clients for years. The FBI got involved once the interstate and international elements of the case became apparent, and Special Agent Thomas Keating from their white-collar crime division arrived to coordinate with the local police on the financial aspects of Veronica's debts and the criminal network she'd been involved with. Agent Keating was a tall man in his early 40s with prematurely silver hair and the kind of intense focus that made you feel like he could see through any lie or deception. He explained that Veronica had been telling the truth about at least part of her situation. She did owe substantial money to dangerous people, approximately $430,000 to a criminal organization operating out of Eastern Europe that specialized in high-stakes online gambling and money laundering. These people had indeed killed her father when he'd defaulted on his debts, though it appeared Veronica had inherited those debts voluntarily by continuing to gamble using accounts her father had established. The FBI had been investigating this organization for 2 years as part of a broader operation targeting international financial crimes, and Veronica's arrest had potentially given them a witness who could provide valuable information about the network's operations. But that wasn't even the most disturbing revelation. Agent Keating told me that during questioning, Veronica had mentioned that I wasn't her first attempt at solving her debt problem through life insurance fraud. She'd had a boyfriend before me, a man named Christopher Lawson, who died 3 years ago of what had been ruled as acute liver failure from undiagnosed hepatitis. Veronica had been the beneficiary of his life insurance policy as well, receiving $600,000 that she'd claimed at the time went toward paying off his medical debts. The FBI was now investigating Christopher's death and had already ordered an exhumation to test for poisons that might have been missed during the original autopsy. If they found evidence that Veronica had killed him too, the attempted murder charges against her would likely be upgraded to include at least 1 count of actual murder. I spent 5 days in the hospital while doctors monitored my response to treatment and waited for my thallium levels to drop to safer ranges. Daniel was there for 7 days and had developed some peripheral neuropathy that doctors said might be permanent, causing numbness and pain in his feet and hands that could last for years, or possibly forever. His wife, Amy, came to visit both of us, and she hugged me while crying and thanking me for calling Daniel and telling him to get to a hospital when I did, because the doctors had told her that decision had saved his life. The gratitude in her eyes made the guilt in my chest feel even heavier, because he shouldn't have needed saving in the first place if I'd been more aware of the danger living in my own home. The legal process moved forward with surprising speed. Veronica's lawyer initially tried to negotiate some kind of deal where she'd provide information about the criminal gambling network in exchange for reduced charges, but the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Margaret Winters, a formidable woman with 23 years of courtroom experience, refused to consider anything less than full prosecution on all charges. She told me during one of our meetings at her office that cases like this demanded the maximum penalty because of the calculated, premeditated nature of the crimes and the complete betrayal of trust involved. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation in the moment, she explained. This was months of planning, purchasing poison, documenting doses, watching you suffer, and continuing with the plan anyway. That speaks to a level of callousness and dangerousness that means she can never be trusted in society again. The investigation into Christopher Lawson's death confirmed what everyone had suspected. His exhumed remains showed elevated levels of arsenic, consistent with chronic poisoning over several months before his death. Veronica had used a different method with him, arsenic instead of thallium, but the pattern was essentially identical. She'd been his girlfriend for 2 years, had convinced him to get a large life insurance policy, had slowly poisoned him while maintaining the appearance of a devoted partner, and had collected the money after his death. She'd used that $600,000 to pay off her gambling debts at the time, but had immediately returned to gambling and had accumulated even larger debts within 18 months, leading her to find a new victim. Me. The realization that I'd essentially been a mark from the very beginning of our relationship was devastating in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Every memory I had with Veronica was now tainted by the knowledge that she'd been evaluating me for my financial potential rather than loving me as a person. The wine tastings where we'd met, the romantic dinners, the weekend trips to Napa Valley, the decision to buy a house together, the life insurance policy, all of it had been part of a long con designed to put her in position to kill me and collect money. Even the sex, the intimacy, the moments where I'd felt closest to her and most vulnerable had been strategic moves in a game I hadn't known I was playing. The woman I'd loved didn't exist and never had existed outside of the role Veronica had been performing. The prosecution brought charges of 2 counts of attempted murder for Daniel and me, 1 count of first-degree murder for Christopher Lawson, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder related to Anton Volkov's involvement, and several financial crimes related to the life insurance applications and her gambling activities. Veronica's trial was set for 6 months after her arrest, and both Daniel and I were subpoenaed to testify about our experiences. The media attention was intense and invasive. Local news stations ran stories with headlines like Sommelier of Death and Wine Country Black Widow, and reporters camped outside my hospital room and later outside the temporary apartment I'd moved into after being discharged, since I couldn't bear to return to the house I'd shared with Veronica. My employer was supportive and gave me extended medical leave to recover and deal with the legal proceedings, but I struggled to function normally for months after the poisoning. The physical effects of the thallium exposure were significant. I lost about 30% of my hair, though doctors assured me it would eventually grow back, and I developed peripheral neuropathy similar to Daniel's, causing constant tingling and occasional sharp pains in my hands and feet. But the psychological damage was worse. I couldn't eat anything I hadn't prepared myself and watched being prepared. I couldn't accept drinks from anyone. I had panic attacks in grocery stores and restaurants. I couldn't sleep without nightmares of Veronica standing over me with a wine glass, smiling while I died. My therapist, Dr. Jennifer Ashworth, specialized in trauma recovery from interpersonal violence and betrayal. She explained that what I was experiencing was a severe form of PTSD combined with something called betrayal trauma, where the violation of trust by someone close causes deep psychological wounds that can be harder to heal than injuries from a stranger. We worked on strategies for managing the anxiety, processing the grief for the relationship I'd thought I had, and rebuilding my ability to trust my own judgment about people since Veronica had so thoroughly deceived me. Dr. Ashworth reminded me frequently that I wasn't stupid or naive for being fooled by Veronica. Sociopaths and people with antisocial personality disorder are often extremely skilled at manipulation and deception, and even trained professionals can be taken in by them. Daniel had his own recovery to manage, both physical and psychological, and we became closer through the shared experience than we'd been before. We met regularly for coffee, though he joked darkly that we should probably avoid wine for the foreseeable future, and talked about our progress, our setbacks, and the surreal reality of having survived a murder attempt by someone we'd trusted. Amy, his wife, was remarkably kind to me, despite the fact that her husband had nearly died because of my girlfriend. She told me that she didn't blame me for what happened, that Veronica was the only one responsible for her actions, and that if anything, she was grateful I'd recognized something was wrong quickly enough to save both our lives. The trial began in March, 6 months after that terrible Sunday when everything had fallen apart. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious observers, and the families of both Christopher Lawson and Henry Moreau, Veronica's father, who were there seeking justice for their own losses. Veronica appeared in court looking dramatically different from the elegant sommelier I'd known. Her hair had been cut short, and she wore minimal makeup and a conservative suit, clearly styled by her defense attorney to appear sympathetic and remorseful. But when she looked at me during the proceedings, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't remorse at all. It was calculation, even now, trying to determine if there was any angle she could work, any manipulation she could attempt. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the journal documenting my poisoning, the text messages with Anton Volkov, the financial records showing Veronica's debts, and the life insurance policies on both Christopher and me, the toxicology reports from all 3 victims, and testimony from Dr. Kapoor and other medical experts about the effects of thallium and arsenic poisoning. They brought in forensic accountants who traced Veronica's gambling losses and showed the jury exactly how much money she'd lost and owed at the time of each murder attempt. They presented evidence that she'd researched thallium poisoning extensively online, visiting forums and medical websites to learn about symptoms and detection methods. When I testified, I had to describe my entire relationship with Veronica for the jury, explaining how we'd met, how our relationship had developed, how I'd felt about her, and how completely I'd been deceived by her performance of love and devotion. I had to read aloud entries from her journal where she'd documented my deteriorating health with the detachment of a scientist recording an experiment. I had to explain how it felt to realize that someone I'd trusted completely had been slowly killing me for months while sleeping beside me every night. The defense attorney tried to suggest, during cross-examination, that I should have noticed something was wrong sooner, that perhaps I'd been willfully blind to signs of Veronica's financial troubles, but the prosecution objected, and the judge sustained it, instructing the jury to disregard the implication that I bore any responsibility for being victimized. Daniel's testimony was similarly powerful, describing how he'd nearly died from drinking wine at his brother's house, how he'd had to be rushed to the emergency room, and how he still suffered from permanent nerve damage from that single exposure to the poison Veronica had intended for me. The medical experts explained that if Daniel had been smaller, or if he'd consumed more of the wine, he almost certainly would have died before reaching the hospital. The jury looked visibly shaken by the time the prosecution rested their case, and several members were wiping away tears. Veronica's defense was predictable and unconvincing. Her attorney tried to paint her as a desperate woman driven to extreme measures by fear of violent criminals who'd threatened her life, arguing that she'd felt she had no choice but to commit these crimes to save herself. He claimed she'd been suffering from extreme psychological duress that impaired her judgment and should mitigate her culpability. He tried to suggest that she'd never actually intended to kill anyone, that she'd been planning to back out at the last minute, that the wine was supposed to be a wake-up call to herself about how far she'd fallen. None of it was credible given the documented evidence of her careful planning, her previous success in killing Christopher Lawson, and the fact that she'd only stopped because Daniel had unexpectedly drunk the poisoned wine, not because of any moral epiphany. When Veronica herself took the stand, she attempted to appear remorseful and broken, crying as she described her gambling addiction and the threats from her creditors. But under cross-examination by ADA Winters, her mask slipped. When pressed about why she hadn't simply declared bankruptcy or gone to the police about the threats, she became defensive and angry. When asked about Christopher Lawson's death, she insisted it had been natural causes despite the forensic evidence. When confronted with specific journal entries describing my symptoms, she tried to claim the journal was fabricated or taken out of context. The jury clearly wasn't buying it, and I could see several of them looking at her with expressions of disgust and disbelief. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. ADA Winters walked the jury through the entire timeline of Veronica's crimes, from her first relationship with Christopher Lawson to her ongoing poisoning of me, showing how each step had been calculated and intentional. She held up the wine bottle that had nearly killed me and my brother, explaining that this single object represented months of planning, research, and cold-blooded execution of a murder scheme. She reminded the jury that Veronica had shown no remorse until after she was caught, that she'd continued with her plan even as she watched me suffer, and that she'd only expressed regret when it became clear she would face consequences. "This is not a woman driven by desperation," Winters told the jury. "This is a predator who identified vulnerable targets, exploited their trust, and attempted to murder them for financial gain. She has shown you who she really is. Believe her." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Veronica showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, maintaining the same calculated composure she'd displayed throughout the trial. At sentencing 2 months later, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement, and I'd prepared extensively with Dr. Ashworth to ensure I could get through it without breaking down. I stood before the court and described what Veronica had stolen from me, not just my health and safety, but my ability to trust, my peace of mind, my sense that the world was a fundamentally comprehensible place where people meant what they said and relationships were real rather than performances. I talked about Daniel's permanent injuries and how he'd been dragged into this nightmare through no fault of his own, except being my brother and showing up at the wrong time. I talked about Christopher Lawson, who'd never gotten justice for his murder because everyone had believed his death was natural until Veronica tried to replicate her success with me. I talked about the nights I still couldn't sleep, the food I couldn't eat, the relationships I couldn't trust myself to build because she'd shown me how completely someone could deceive me. And I talked about the future I'd thought we were building together, which had all been a lie designed to facilitate my murder. The judge listened intently, and several people in the courtroom gallery were crying by the time I finished. The judge sentenced Veronica to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Christopher's murder, plus consecutive sentences of 35 years each for the attempted murders of Daniel and me. With additional time for the fraud charges and conspiracy, she was effectively guaranteed to die in prison. As she was led out of the courtroom, she looked back at me one final time, and I saw no remorse in her expression. Just cold assessment, like she was still trying to calculate whether there was some angle she'd missed, some manipulation she could still attempt. She'd killed at least one person, tried to kill 2 more, and her only regret seemed to be that she'd been caught rather than successful. 1 year after that Sunday when my world had imploded, I was doing better. Not perfect, not healed, but better. The physical effects of the thallium poisoning had mostly resolved. My hair had grown back, though slightly different in texture than before, and the peripheral neuropathy had improved significantly with physical therapy, though I still had occasional numbness in my extremities. I'd sold the house I'd bought with Veronica and moved to a different neighborhood entirely, wanting no reminders of the life we'd shared. I'd returned to work full-time and had even started dating again, though I was proceeding very cautiously and had been completely honest with my therapist about my trust issues and need to take things slowly. Daniel had recovered as well as could be expected. His neuropathy was more persistent than mine and had required him to modify his teaching methods since he had difficulty writing on the chalkboard for extended periods, but his school had been accommodating and he was back to work full-time. His daughter, who'd been just 6 months old when her father was poisoned, was now a happy, healthy toddler who had no memory of how close she'd come to losing him. Amy had told me more than once that she considered me part of their family now, bound by the shared trauma we'd survived and the fact that my quick thinking had saved Daniel's life. The criminal gambling network that Veronica had been involved with was dismantled by the FBI using information from her case and other investigations they'd been pursuing. Anton Volkov was arrested in Poland and extradited to the United States to face charges related to selling poison and conspiracy to commit murder. Several other members of the organization were also indicted, though Veronica herself received no consideration or reduced sentence for the information since she'd only provided it after being convicted and sentenced. The FBI had thanked me for my cooperation with their investigation And Agent Keating had told me that my case had been the break they'd needed to finally take down a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over a decade. I still thought about Veronica sometimes, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep. I thought about the woman I'd believed I was in love with, the future we'd discussed, the life we'd supposedly been building together. I thought about how completely I'd been fooled, how thoroughly she'd infiltrated my life and gained my trust while planning to kill me. And I thought about how close she'd come to succeeding. If Daniel hadn't shown up that morning, if I'd drunk that full bottle of poisoned wine alone as she'd intended, I would almost certainly have died within hours, and she would have collected her insurance payout and moved on to find another victim once she'd gambled that money away too. But I also thought about resilience, about how Daniel and I had survived something that should have killed us, about how we'd both found ways to rebuild our lives and move forward despite the trauma. I thought about the people who'd supported me through the darkest time of my life, my family, my friends, my colleagues, my therapist, the medical professionals who'd saved my life, and the law enforcement officers who'd ensured Veronica faced justice. I thought about the fact that I was alive, that I'd gotten a second chance that Christopher Lawson never had, and that I owed it to myself and to him to make the most of the life Veronica had tried to steal. Dr. Ashworth told me that recovery from this kind of trauma isn't linear, that there would be good days and bad days, setbacks and progress, and that I shouldn't expect to ever completely get over what happened to me. But she also reminded me that survival itself is a kind of victory, that every day I continued to live and build a future was a repudiation of Veronica's plan to end my life for her financial benefit. I was learning to trust again, slowly and carefully. I was learning to enjoy food and wine again without constant fear of contamination. I was learning to believe that not everyone was performing a role, that genuine connection was possible even after such profound betrayal. The anniversary wine that Veronica had brought home that Sunday was supposed to have been my last. Instead, it became Daniel's near-death experience and Veronica's complete undoing. The freeze on her face when I'd told her I'd shared it with my brother had been the moment when her carefully constructed plan had fallen apart, when the variables she couldn't control had intersected with her scheme in a way that exposed everything. If I'd drunk that wine alone as she'd intended, if Daniel hadn't unexpectedly visited, if I hadn't noticed something wrong in Veronica's panic, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. But I am here. I survived. And Veronica will spend the rest of her life in prison knowing that her perfect plan failed because of one unexpected variable she couldn't account for and one brother who happened to show up at the right time. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.